Welcome, everybody. My name is Dr. Sacoby Wilson. I'm director for the Center Community Engagement, Wellness, and Health. Happy to have you here at the end of our second day of the eighth UMD Environmental Justice and Health Disparities Symposium. This closing plenary is entitled Old Energy versus New Energy, Ensuring Just Energy Transitions. I mean, this is serendipitous. I'm not sure how we planned this out so perfectly with our theme of this particular session and also the theme of this event, this symposium, energy versus power, visions for the future, but with the recently, potentially fully passed Inflation Reduction Act, I'm sorry, plus other actions that happen around energy issues in this country. This is a great conversation to be having today. So we have a great lineup of speakers to talk about these issues around, again, old energy versus new energy. First, we had Leticia Colon de Mejias. And Leticia, if I said it wrong, you can correct me when you get on the mic. She is founder and CEO with Energy Efficiency Solutions, EES, and she is a US EPA National Environmental Justice Advisory Council member. As a founder of EES in Connecticut, she does a lot of work on energy conservation issues. She's received numerous awards related to environmental justice and her DEI efforts. Our second speaker of the day is Jose Bravo, Executive Director of Just Transition Alliance. Jose is a veteran environmental justice organizer and executive director of this alliance. In his role, he's been doing this work for more than 20 years, leading the coalition of environmental justice groups and labor organizations. His work is really about focusing on frontline workers, very important part of the EJ movement. Remember, that's 17 principles of environmental justice, and one of those principles focuses on workers. So it's great to have Jose here representing the voices of frontline workers. Then we have Yinka Bode-George. She's senior manager of environmental justice and community impact for Vote Energy. She's interim executive director for Sharing the Power Foundation, a national philanthropic nonprofit to advance environmental justice, inclusive clean energy future through grant making. That's an arm of Vote Energy. She provides the overall strategy development for the foundation. Then we have Saniya LeBlanc, associate professor at George Washington University. She's in the Department of Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering and director of the Energy Innovation Initiative at George Washington University. This initiative builds research and engagement capacity in three themes: energy as an equity enabler, the next generation energy network, and multi-scale materials for energy. So we're excited to have our panelists today. We have another panelist, and I think if she shows up, I'll introduce her, but I'm going to get into this show right now. So let's get started with introductions. Can you kind of just talk about each panelist, your current role, your work on energy and power issues, and how this relates to, the theme of this session today. So let's start with Leticia.
Thank you so much. Ultimately, what I'm seeing in the environmental justice arena as it relates to the clean energy transition and really climate action overall is that we need to ensure that we focus on the basic necessities in communities. So I think it's really critical that we empower people with climate change information, climate action information, allow them to know how to build resilience in their communities, ensure that there are not barriers to creating that resilience in their homes, buildings, businesses, and schools or community places. I also have found that it's really critical to elevate the educational needs, specifically being supportive of at-risk and frontline communities. What I've been seeing in my work over the last 20 years is that we really don't have many action-based approaches in solving the environmental justice issues as they relate to energy. We keep finding many ways to use energy, but so few ways to look at how the impacts of the many new types of energies are impacting our communities and communities of color. I also think that oftentimes people feel abandoned kind of in their daily strife and need to know that we see them and hear them and that we're going to help them by empowering them with information and careers. I heard you say that too. It's really important that as we make this transition that we do it in a just and equitable way, which would mean we have to increase the scientific level of knowledge in those communities that have been unjustly left behind. Specifically, I find that in communities of color, they're not offering science in grade school. it's like the equivalent, in my opinion, of trying to teach us French when we turn 18. It would be good to have some of those sets of data a little earlier and have exposure to some of those scientific concepts, like where does energy come from? What are the pollution effects? That all things are connected, or even the idea that heat rises. All of these are scientific concepts that many communities have never had the opportunity to understand or be exposed to. Because of that, they may not know things such as all water and air are connected, or that we're all breathing and drinking essentially the same water and air. So it's critical to protect water and air. And I also think that it's really important that we consider financial resources to support those frontline communities and allow them access to things like solar, ductless mini splits, housing retrofits like insulation, air sealing, that would make their homes and buildings stable, resilient, comfortable, and also would reduce the amount of pollution locally in those communities, providing local jobs. And the last thing I want to say is that ultimately what I've learned in my career as an environmental justice leader is that if there's buildings with a B, adults with an A, you can make careers with a C. And we've missed out on those opportunities for those really good paying clean energy careers and other scientific based careers. This is the fine opportunity, like the time is now, where we can connect those communities to workforce training, science-based information in schools, community centers, and ensure that they're prepared and have the capacity to become resilient to climate change.
Jose next.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson, for inviting us to come and speak today. I want to say that, of all of the environmental justice injustices in the environmental justice movement, I think the issue of energy is one of the top issues that uses race as an indicator for the impact on communities of color and low-income communities. So let's just start it off right there. So since the revolution, we have been living with the dirty legacy and continue to live with the dirty legacy of old energy. And as we're talking about the old and new, I think that we're going to be living with that legacy for generations to come. So let's just make sure that we put that into our thinking process moving forward. So in order for us to move into a new paradigm of clean energy or better energy, we must make sure that the issues that were brought about by dirty energy get resolved in our communities. We can't just move forward and think that tomorrow, we can move towards uh, clean energy and not deal with what is the result of historic contamination in our communities. So we need to look at it that way. I think that when we and as we move into this new energy paradigm, I think we need to really take a close look at what we're doing and not repeat some of the things of the past. So, what I mean by that is that as we look at transitioning into a new energy economy, we need to address the following: who owns that energy? Is it us, or is it an energy company again? The other piece is who gets to build the new energy infrastructure? Is it somebody else, or is it our communities? Right? And so those jobs go to our communities as well. And then, where will the discarded materials from this new energy infrastructure end up? Where are all the batteries and recycling places going to be? Is it going to be back in our community? Are we the ones that are going to be left holding the bag again for all these probable millions of batteries from electric vehicles? We're still living the legacy of battery pollution and battery contamination from this last go around. So ultimately, I think we need to look at that very careful. And then, how is it connected to the goals on climate? Right? For instance, the Just Transition Alliance believes that if we don't start producing mass transit, non-polluting mass transit vehicles in Detroit, by the way, in Detroit, if we don't start producing those mass transit vehicles in Detroit, we're not going to reach our goals. We're not going to reach our goals by 2035, 2050. Um, and if we don't put money now in creating the infrastructure for mass transit and move those subsidies away from the oil and chemical industry to make transportation free for everyone, we're not going to get there. We're not going to get there. All we're going to be doing at the moment is extending the life of fossil fuels by making plastic for electric cars. You know, by the way, that's where plastic comes from, fossil fuels. So I think we need to look deeper into what we want to build.
Okay.
And then how much of what goes into the cradle will come back towards the cradle, right? And be reused. I think this is paramount because we should just say that we're not going to mine anything anymore because there's enough material out there to keep us going for a long time. We just got to be more efficient at reusing things.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Let me go to the next speaker. Who will I have? Saniya, you're up next.
Thank you. Well, I wish I could just say what they said. I agree with all of that. I will add a perspective from the academic research side and from academia. I think that we're at a point now where we are obligated to be engaging in community engaged research, community-based research. I do believe in research. I believe in the power of research. So I do think research is useful. I think we need to transition the way we do it. And so we're looking at ways to do that. How do we actually work across disciplines to learn how to do research in ways that many of us maybe didn't know before? And what does that look like in practice? And so to Leticia's point, I thought, what you said was fantastic. One of the things that we're working on is how do we actually use this knowledge that we have, that we've spent so many years creating and developing, and use it to engage people with what this energy transition is about. And so that's what we're doing. How do we leverage new technologies and technological approaches as part of the solution and part of the transition? And how do we help people who could use the things that are kind of residing in our head and in our laboratories? How do we actually get it out the door to them? And that's what we're trying to do.
No, thank you for that. So that's the application science, the engagement science, the action science. And that actually, it speaks to the issues around equity too. Science is not, to me, science is not working unless you're doing all dimensions of science. And a lot of the science that we've seen out there has been colonial and really it's been exploitative. So it's really great to hear y'all talk about making science actually walk and talk for the people. And Yinka, I didn't look at my script right, but your turn next, Yinka. Go ahead. Sorry about that.
No worries at all. So, hello everyone. My name is Yinka Bode-George, and I reside on the unceded lands of the Piscataway people. And thank you, Dr. Wilson, for my introduction. I'll just mention that, as the executive director of Sharing the Power Foundation, the foundation advances environmental justice and an inclusive clean energy future through grant making and seeding the next generation of environmental leaders. So the foundation funds organizations addressing environmental injustices. We invest in clean energy infrastructure in our most vulnerable communities. And we also facilitate these clean energy and sustainability career pathways for students. I'll talk a lot about this work later in our conversation. I also, as Dr. Wilson said, lead the community impact and environmental justice strategy for Volt Energy Utility, which is a utility scale solar development firm. So solar farms, not necessarily rooftop solar. So with both of the hats that I wear, I'm currently working to ensure that community members who have been historically and even presently excluded from the benefits of the clean energy sector are now being centered and receiving those benefits in the ways that my co-panelists have already really identified. And I approach my work by focusing on the systems and culture that led to environmental injustices in the climate crisis, right? And building systems and promoting cultural practices that create environmental justice, equity, and liberation. So really, a lot of our work also includes dismantling problematic systems in order to create regenerative ones. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that today. And it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you all.
Oh, thank you for that. Thanks for those first statements. And just you're talking about energy sovereignty, right? We're talking about liberation. I love the use of liberation, right? And sovereignty. And again, as Jose mentioned, I know he'll dig into this. You can't have folks that are part of the dirty fossil fuel system be the ones supposedly going to do clean energy. How are you going to benefit from all this transition and the taxpayers' dollars to do these investments when you were part of the problem? I don't understand that. That can't be the way we move forward, whether it be the Inflation Reduction Act or other things that we're doing. The folks that create a problem can't then also benefit from these new dollars. That we need new players, new voices, new faces like Vote and others out there, Orsted and others out there who are actually on the clean energy spectrum and not the dirty energy spectrum, getting my money as a taxpayer. I'm sorry, that's a problem. So let's move on to the next question. So what does transitioning from dirty fossil fuels to clean energy mean for already underserved BIPOC and low-income communities, tribal communities, workers, right? What are some ways in which BIPOC and low-income communities, tribal communities, and workers are already impacted by, in a positive way, by clean energy and clean energy transitions? Give us some examples. So Leticia, you're up first.
Well, ultimately, this is a very tricky question, in my opinion, right? Here's the reason why. So it could have such a positive impact. But historically, what we have seen is quite the opposite. Whenever there's an environmental justice transition seeking to make things better, it should be really positive for communities of color, BIPOC communities, and others who are disadvantaged. But ultimately, the way that things have happened historically is this idea of a trickle-down effect. The idea that if you give the money to people who have a lot of money, and in their opinion are already successful and are already solving problems, or people who look like you, walk like you, and talk like you, that they will somehow magically solve the problem. But as you might know, it doesn't often work that way. And so in order to actually make changes for those communities and solve those problems, we have to take an inclusive approach to solving them. That would mean that they need to see themselves represented in the solution-based approaches. They should be solicited for information on how to solve the problems with which they are living. So I'll use an example to set the stage. I live in Connecticut. In Hartford, there is a power plant behind the high school that I went to. This power plant is in process making pollution every day, but the kids there know nothing about it. No one talks to them about it. Nobody has provided them information. There's been no education. So they've never advocated to have that plant shut down. I see this all across America in my work with NIAC. Oftentimes, those closest to the problem are farthest from the potential solutions, and those who are closest to the resources which could solve the problem are so far from the problem that they're unaware of what needs to be solved. Thus, they make solutions that don't fit, like Jose said, for example, electric vehicles. The way that I see the transition happening in the clean energy structure currently, it looks like everybody's going to get an EV, like you get an EV, you get an EV. But the reality is that that's unlikely to occur. It's more likely that we'll see more of the same, whereby people with lots of power and privilege will get EVs. In fact, they already have them. And they'll think that somehow those will trickle down to us, people of color or low-income people in at-risk communities, and that magically we'll have money for licenses, parking, insurance, registration, when we can't even afford houses and food. So the best way to make this transition work would be to look at equity-based approaches that would look at real problems, like instead of thinking all boats rise with the tide, you would say, not everyone has a boat. Some of us don't know how to swim. Some of us never had a swimming pool. Therefore, when the tide rises, we shall be drowning and they'll use us as floats. Unless we take an approach that is inclusive now and do what Mr. Jose said, what Mr. Bravo said, which is create mass transportation like they've done in other countries that is accessible to everyone and at a low cost, which would get us to our jobs and we could become gainful taxpayers instead of recipients of handouts. These are just some suggestions, but I'm also a building scientist. So I also find that direct installments of action-based approaches like drawing down demand through retrofitting buildings, businesses, and schools, which is the most low-cost, highly effective carbon reducer, because most carbon is not coming out the tailpipe, it's coming out of that electric plant, which is powering our lives, homes, and schools, and not our cars. So I have more to say on that, but I don't want to, steal the air in the room. I think it's really critical that what you're having here today, this whole conversation about power versus power, because at the end of the day, realistically, it's all about power, whether it's what we plug our phone and lights into, keep ourselves warm or our food hot and safe, or whether it's the power that runs our political systems, which have excluded some of us from the conversations until now. Thank you.
Thank you. So you get the whole meaning: energy versus power, power versus power. Yes, that's what we're talking about today. Thank you for that. Up to you, Jose, again.
So I think, first of all, I think that we need to actually look at creating local local economies to scale and regional economies to scale, instead of what we have now, which is a globalized economy that has literally made people very rich and others, the majority, very poor. So I think we need to take a look at that and move away from all these globalized treaties that literally now, if you see that because of microchips that are being produced in another country and the lack of materials for those microchips, things stop or go down to a standstill. I think that we need to take care of our own food infrastructure and look at the big picture of things. If we look at how energy now plays a role and the derivatives of energy play a role in what happens in our community, we start putting two and two together. When we're looking at weatherizing people's homes and those kinds of things in order to make it a better R value, that means somewhere down in Cancer Valley, a plant is going to ask for an expansion to produce more PVC as we stand right now. So what we should do is look at other materials, make sure that we are building with better, healthy materials, and not putting or shifting the burden on communities that are already overburdened. So that's what I would say to that.
Thank you, Jose. Let's go to Yinka.
Sure. So as my co-panelists have already outlined, the transition from dirty energy to clean energy means so many things. And advancing environmental justice really does require us to shift from an extractive economy based in the destructive fossil fuels toward a more regenerative circular economy that includes non-toxic, clean, renewable energies, but also so many things. This shift would fundamentally change our communities positively in terms of community health and local economies, as Mr. Bravo was just talking about. So I think, the toxic exposures that communities face because of our current energy system, that would significantly diminish if we were no longer reliant on that. And then the healthy job creation that comes from just a circular economy and the access to those jobs, I think that's a really important piece to talk about with our community members. But there's also so many people and organizations working toward these issues right now, like the community solar efforts that align with the more localized energy systems and things like that. But there's also like waste material recovery cooperatives that have started to proliferate. And I want to shout out my good friend Dante Swinton in Baltimore, who started a glass recovery cooperative in a way to divert from the energy created from waste incineration, right? This is such an interdisciplinary issue with so many different opportunities to be activated and positively impact our communities. It's amazing. And I also think naming some of the nuances, right? And I'm so grateful that my co-panelists have already done that. Things like Black farmers not being able to access solar farm development because of a history of divestment on their lands, right? They're now seeing a lot of challenges when it comes to just doing the general inspections before you can break ground on a solar project. Like that's what we mean when we talk about a legacy of racism and divestment and things that could potentially create more inequities when we're building a new, regenerative economy. So naming those things, working toward addressing them, and being very specific and nuanced when it comes to those equity considerations are really important.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I really appreciate the panelists talking about those nuances and again, that hit or miss bill, that Inflation Reduction Act, the fact that, as Jose mentioned, and y'all are talking about, who's the burden as this, and if we have there's an energy transition, but as outlined in that bill, it's not going to be just. And y'all giving examples of why it's not going to be just. Saniya, you're up next.
Well, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'd like to look at like the positive side of what's happening. I'm going to use DC as an example. So in DC's ward, so DC has 8 wards. It's geographically divided into 8 wards. Those are our communities. DC's wards 5, 7, and 8 have the highest percentage of Black residents, the highest rates of death attributable to air pollution. They are the lowest income. They have the highest infant mortality rates. Around 2014, through Solar for All, those wards were prioritized as the wards in which solar generation projects would be created. So wards 5, 7, and 8 in DC, they are responsible for 58% of the solar generation that's generated in DC. That's an example, I think, of how we need to be going through the energy transition. That transition's still underway, right? It's still very much underway in DC, but that to me is an indicator of the light that's coming, because through this transition, it means that there's economic and workforce impact, and we can think about that. We can plan for that. There are health impacts that we can plan for. And what I think it means when we do this, when we actually put these underserved communities at the forefront, is it means that these communities are the leaders as the first movers in the energy transition. And when you're the first mover in an energy transition, that leadership position is power. So I view it much like the open plenary speaker. Energy is power. It's not versus. Energy is power. And when we do projects like that, when we really put them at the forefront and say, you get the energy transition first, that leadership is really powerful. I do want to comment on the energy transition as it relates to renewable energy projects. Yinka made a great comment about what is your ability? How are you enabled or disenabled for being a site that benefits from utility scale solar? I think that's what's really interesting, and that I have been reading the aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act to try to parse out in my head how this is going to go down. When I speak to solar project developers, it looks very monolithic. When I am in those meetings, when I am in those rooms, I don't see the message that we have heard so much at the symposium that resonates so deeply with us. I don't see that coming out in those conversations. And I think that's an important aspect of the economic and workforce impact of the energy transition. Who is at the table? Who is doing this? As a woman in engineering, I walk into those rooms, a woman of color in engineering, I walk into those rooms and I see who are the people out there that are taking the risks on the solar projects that are going to make a whole lot of money from it. It's not us. And I think we need to confront that. And I am hoping with the legislation that we're seeing that we somehow will see that. It's not laid out quite clearly enough in the legislation for me to be convinced of how that's going to happen. But I think enough of us being active in this area hopefully will allow the energy transition to happen in a way that makes energy power for people who have been disempowered.
No, thank you for that. And just to highlight reemphasize some things y'all said. I think one of you said, we have boats. Everybody doesn't have a boat, right? So how do we emphasize those who, as I said earlier, and I think Jose mentioned it, who've been impacted the most by the dirty energy infrastructure? So as I like to say, those who are in the front line should be at the front of the lines. I think y'all emphasized that point. That's the way we're making sure that we really having an equity focused agenda when it comes to the just energy transition. So I appreciate y'all really hitting those points home. So this next question, I'm gonna go to Yinka first on this question. So how can we make sure that the communities that we're talking about, front line, fence line, who've been impacted by the most by the dirty energy infrastructure. And as Jose mentioned, it's really a racist system, right? And let's just call it what it is. That these communities are ones we focus on, and how are you engaging in your work these communities? So we think about recognitional justice, 17 principles of environmental justice, principles 5 and 7. Communities speak their own voice, right? How are we making sure these communities, the 10 climate justice principles, the ones that are most impacted, that we're engaging them, getting them a seat at the table, and how are you doing that to bring them in to drive this just energy transition? I know you talked about a few examples already, but I'm gonna give you a chance to give a few more examples for the audience. Go ahead, Yinka. Yinka, you're up first.
Absolutely. You know, I'm so glad that we're talking about how just as a sector, the makeup of this sector is racist. There aren't diverse, there isn't diversity in the scale that it needs to be for us to really center these, issues and solutions in really critical ways. And that's a huge problem. And it's been this way for decades. I think we're just now getting to the point where the clean energy sector, the energy sector at large, but specifically the clean energy sector, is starting to get a little more diverse. And even in that, it's like barely. So at the foundation, we take these issues of diversity very, very seriously, and are putting forth solutions that we hope will really work to overturn them. So we do a lot of work with students, I mentioned earlier, and we focus our student development on HBCU students, so students who attend historically Black colleges and universities, and actually have plans to grow that target population to all minority serving institutions, but we're focusing first on our HBCU institutions. We have a phenomenal fellowship program called the Volt Energy Environmental Justice Ambassador Fellowship, where we identify students and give them internship experiences at environmental justice grassroots organizations for the summer. But during the summer, they also get professional development seminars. So we expose them to the array of jobs and the networks that you need to really access clean energy jobs. Because we know in the clean energy sector, there's so many different job opportunities. And we know that our young people may not even have a good orientation of what those jobs look like, right? You can do supply chain management, you can work in government affairs, research, etc. We want to make sure that we're exposing students to these opportunities at a young age so that they know accessing these opportunities are possible for them. So that's one way that we're really targeting the lack of diversity issue in clean energy and orienting the students with a strong environmental justice analysis. I can't say that enough. It's one thing to, diversify the sector. It's another thing to diversify the sector with I don't like to say army, but, a group, a community of people that have a strong environmental justice orientation to their work. That's how we shift the systems and create more liberatory systems.
Oh, I love that. And we had a session earlier today about environmental justice and liberation science. For those you don't know, this is a shameless plug. We have a special issue on liberation science in the Journal of Environmental Justice. I'm editor-in-chief. But yes, liberation, liberation, liberation. Let's go to Saniya next.
I echo a lot of the ideas around much of the impact we can have being rooted in education and engagement of our youth. They are the ones making the change happen. I think I maybe bring a different perspective than I've heard before on this, perhaps because I do engage in a PWI type of environment quite a bit, and I think it's really important to broaden people's perspectives and do a couple of things in that. Teach systems thinking. I don't think we can take it for granted that people understand how everything is connected. We have to teach that. And I think that you can teach it from many different angles and many facets. And the fact that it is multifaceted is a part of the education that needs to happen. So that systems thinking and how things are connected, I think, is very important. And then the other one is, how do you be an ally? What does that mean? I think that in particularly science and engineering education, our curricula are so rigorous. If somebody's kind of going into this area, we're really putting them through the ringer to do this. But we can't forget that a part of what we have to do is educate them to be the people that they're going to be for the rest of their lives, the rest of their careers and their professions. And that means helping to broaden people's perspectives. And I think allowing people the space to learn how to become an ally is a really important part of what we can do. And we can do that in multiple ways. And I think I view that as much of the role that we have in education.
Thank you for that. So yeah, we need to have allies that are MSIs, are PWIs, or whatever other acronym you want to use, that making sure we have folks who understand these issues and training up the next generation, particularly the next generation of folks who come from the communities, right? That's very, very important. I wouldn't be here. I came from community. My dad's a pipe fitter, so I understand this sector very well. I grew up near a landfill. Well, my mom keeps reminding me, my mom was tell a story. Like, son, you keep forgetting the landfill. I always mention sewage treatment plant, but I forget the landfill. So our context matters. We need people from these contexts being trained. So to you, Jose, you're up next. Community engagement. What are you doing to engage the community and the worker population, right? Go ahead, Jose.
So I think that education and community engagement, as you're saying, is paramount, especially right now. I think that when we're talking about this new energy compared to old energy, we have to look at the fact too that some of these legislation, some of these movements are moving us in the wrong direction. For us, we don't see incinerators as a viable source of energy. Point blank. That's it. No other discussion. It's not a viable source of energy. We also don't see nuclear energy as a viable source of energy. And if you think that nuclear energy is a viable source of energy, I invite you to go visit the Navajo Nation and look at the legacy that nuclear energy has left there. And I don't see, to an extent, I don't see even biofuels being the future, because a lot of companies, big companies, Phillips 66, is trying to shift into using soy as the feedstock for biofuel. And what happens when a company starts using food as an energy? What happens here? What happens all over the world? Things get more pricey, right? And then there's clear cutting of forests to plant soy, to do all this other stuff for the thirst of creating fuel. And then the other one that, we deviate a little bit from our brothers and sisters in labor on is hydrogen. We have to understand that it takes a lot of energy, especially a lot of fossil fuels, to create hydrogen. So moving us towards the creation of hydrogen at the moment is giving an extension to the life of fossil fuels. So it defeats the purpose.
Yeah, thank you for that. So you're talking about this entrenchment issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a false solution, right? When we're gonna new clean energy, where you're using dirty energy as the feedstock.
Yes.
So whether it be biogas, as you're saying, you got other things that you mentioned. So we have to move away from that entrenchment and have a clean break. We cannot be relying on what the dirty fossil fuels that got in the situation in the first place. Energy injustice is connected to environmental injustice, it's connected to climate injustice. And so I appreciate those comments. I'm gonna go to Leticia next. Well, how you engage, you talked about a little bit, but how are you engaging communities, frontline offensive communities in this work? And what are some examples, some best practices that you've seen in your work?
Oh, I'm ready.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm ready. So ultimately what I learned I worked 16 years in healthcare prior to getting an environmental justice. That's how I became an environmental justice advocate in healthcare. While working in research at a large healthcare institution, I learned that the number one cause of health issues is energy production and distribution. From the point of extraction to the point of delivery, we are being poisoned all along the path. And most interesting to me in my research was actually this whole frontline communities thing, which I had been unaware of previously before coming upon this information. So now all I do is go out everywhere and explain it. And what I learned is that the data and research that was available prior to my company existing was all written at a high level, college bound, criteria. Who's going to read it? Who wants to read 263 pages of stuff that makes no sense? So I took all that information and I condensed it into next generation science standard books written at a 4th grade reading level in multiple languages. Because now that information is accessible, attainable, and people can actually be empowered by it. The second thing I did was make all that information free. I started a nonprofit and a for-profit at the same time. My for-profit energy efficiency solution funds my nonprofit Green Eco Warriors, which has provided hundreds of thousands of free books all across the United States of America that align with next generation science standards, because I believe science is power. I believe that when you know the laws of science, that you can control the world around you. It's quite factual, as a matter of fact. The idea of electricity itself was just a thought at one time. Now it's everywhere, right? Back in the day when someone said about electricity, no one believed it could be possible, containable, or manageable. But over time, we learned that it was. And so likewise, I do this with adults. I take this next generation science standard curriculum, I turned it into videos. They're short little TED Talk style videos, and they explain things like, where does your energy come from? What type of careers are there? I have training programs. They're only 12 weeks long. An adult that has never worked in this industry of efficiency or clean energy can go to one of my courses in the state of Connecticut for free and be paid to sit in class, have childcare, get transportation, get housing, and then get a career. These careers start anywhere between $15 and $25 an hour. We just graduated a cohort of 15 students with only $100,000, and all 15 students 9 months later are still gainfully employed, and they beat the benefits cliffs because we provide things like prosperity training, agency training, how to buy a home, get off Section 8. Why don't you need EBT? We teach them also a continual paths forward. So maybe they come in as an entry-level field technician making $15, $17 an hour. Within 1 year, our goal is to have them at $20 an hour minimum, along with health insurance, life insurance, and retirement plans. So ultimately, what we've done is take things that people said were impossible and make them quite possible. These are people that have high school diplomas or GEDs. Sometimes they don't, and I help them get a GED or a driver's license or a car. So the idea is that when fully resourced, minority-run organizations can actually help other minorities because they know what they look like, they understand the problems, they know the solutions, and we care about one another in our communities. And so in that case, we would be lifting all people with the tide because we'd let them get in our boat. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned, science is power, empowerment science. Love it because we talk about that all the time. Community science is important, and contextual experts working together. So I appreciate that. And then also the wraparound approach. You're giving people, you're wrapping around and giving them all kind of life skills training with the training as relates to being in this sector. So that's important.
You know what else? We meet people where they're at and we see them as they are. No one has to be perfect to have a job. And the other thing is it's critical to understand that there are life things that are needed for someone to succeed. These things are air. You'll die without it. Try holding your breath and see how you like it. Water. That's the next thing you're going to need. Then you're going to need food. And then you're going to need shelter. These are actual critical life needs. Sometimes people think that they're like exemplary things they're giving us, but we'll die without them. So I feel like those necessities should be critical in the environmental justice lane, and as part of Justice 40, and as any federal funding should consider the capacity to stay alive, because you certainly can't be successful or contribute to American society if you're dead. Thank you.
Thank you for that. As my colleague would say, Mustafa Ali would say, moving from surviving to thriving. And like to say, environmental justice is proximal, everyday, and pocketbook. You connect to food, faith, family, health, and jobs. That's what's important to folks. So thank you for that. I'm gonna move to Saniya. Let's go a question about, you do innovative research on clean energy technologies. Can you describe a little bit more of that work? I know you hit upon a little bit of this work and how this kind of work can be helpful in ensuring just energy transitions in the areas of production, consumption, energy storage, and energy delivery.
Sure. Yeah, I'll use a specific project that we have ongoing now, where we're looking at how do you actually manage all different kinds of energy technology. So, and we're actually working on a project so that people can visualize it, like a lit up architectural model of DC, so you can actually see electricity, heating, cooling, water, how it actually all is connected through buildings throughout the city. But we have what is currently a very technical model where we actually look at the trade-offs. If you have combined heat and power plants, if you have rooftop solar, if you have absorption chillers, if you're thinking about bringing in battery storage, if you're thinking about bringing in thermal storage, there's actually a whole suite of technologies out there. That's part of the message that we do want to get out there is there's actually a whole suite of technologies. It's not just the things that you're hearing about like batteries. And what we're doing is we have actually built a system that allows us to look at if you had all these different technologies and you can turn all of them on and off depending on which ones you want to explore, what's the impact on your community, on your collection of buildings? So if you were to bring in battery storage, what would the cost of that be? But what would the impact be in terms of resilience? And we can actually run it and say, well, let's say a big storm is coming, right? Let's say a major storm is coming. If you had this technology, what would the impact be on the community? The idea of doing this, having this model, and it's got all the things. I have these really smart PhD students working on it. They've incorporated artificial intelligence and all of those kinds of things to make it work. But the value of it is we can go to folks like the policymakers in DC, and we have these really great partnerships with DC Department of Energy and Environment, where we can say, hey, what do you want us to explore, right? Which buildings do you want to look at? Are you doing a new public housing installation and considering what technologies you want to put in there? Well, we can help inform that decision. Let's go through this together. And what we have found is that there's a lot of impact. I mean, for example, a recent meeting that we did with them, I feel very passionately about this idea of electrification of everything. I think that it's much more nuanced than that, than just electrify everything. If we go that route, we will be causing more harm. So we need to be a little bit more nuanced than that. And so we were able to go in and say, here's a comparison between battery storage and thermal storage. Here are the trade-offs. Let's look at the materials aspect, for example. The materials used in thermal storage, in every respect, they're more established. They are less environmentally harmful. I would say that I'm a material scientist in a lot of ways. And so lots of materials can have harm, even if you think it's a harmless material. So, it's about the relative harm. But for thermal storage, nothing like the kinds of materials that you have in batteries. They have very high capacity. They're lower cost. They're an established technology. Well, this is something where when we work on the people who work on technologies and have that knowledge, it is on us to get out there and share that knowledge and show these analyses and say, what is it that you want us to use this knowledge and analysis to do? And I think that's a really good example of one of the specific kinds of projects we're doing, where we've incorporated specifically for urban environments, incorporating distributed generation, renewable generation, like solar panels, battery storage, thermal storage, and looking at what does it mean in terms of how much it will cost, the return value to the community, the resilience and reliability of those technologies. And we're trying to build it out to enable people to make decisions about the technologies that they want to adopt and how they want to go about the energy transition.
Thank you for that. I'm going to shuffle around a little bit with a couple of questions. I know we're getting close to I want to leave hopefully at least 15 minutes for Q&A. So I'm going to move through a few other questions. So we haven't talked so much about workers. Jose, so I'm going to jump to you next. Your work focuses on creating a sustainable economy that does not sacrifice, fence line, frontline workers who've been dependent on polluted facilities. So can you talk about, how do we address some of these issues around workers and this energy transition a little bit more? And what are some recommendations? What are some best practices? What are some examples out there of the Blue-Green Alliance or the Blue-Green Energy Alliance, whatever you want to call it, where workers are being put first
How
And then
about
we're making sure that not just the just transition for workers who are going to lose dirty fossil fuel jobs, but as we talked about, for workers who've never gotten a clean energy job because they don't look like the folks who've been in those jobs, because that's been very a white sector, just to be frank. So go ahead and speak to those issues, Jose.
yeah, definitely a lot of issues around worker privilege. You know, when we first came together with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, one of the things that we had to remind them was that when they talked about contract workers and others in a negative way, those contract workers are probably us, people that looked like us, that were willing to do the things that mostly those white men wouldn't do in the refinery or the chemical plant. So those refineries and chemical plants would hire from our communities temporary workers without training them and a bunch of other things of that nature. So they were us, and it was in their best interest to start organizing workers of color and those workers coming out of those temporary agencies and bringing them into the fold. So I want to ask you a question, Dr. Wilson. I'll ask you a question. What do
Okay,
you
Jose.
think? What do you think is? We did a recent survey of some workers in in refinery, in the refinery sector. What do you really think they came up as was the answer to a question? Is what is the most prevalent issue right now in regards to your job? What do you think it was?
Most prevalent issue
Hmm.
is job security, probably.
It has to do with job security. So we were thinking that they were going to start telling us, oh, you know, this sunsetting of fossil fuels, we better get on that. You know, we better start hurrying up and try to figure out how we transition that to that. Is no. The most pressing issue for workers right now is automation.
Automation. Oh, yes, sir.
Automation. They feel that that's coming next week.
Hmm.
And the end of fossil fuels is coming probably 100 years from now,
Hmm.
literally. So they were saying, you know, automation, that's it, because it costs less to run a plant. It's less in insurance. They can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without complaining, without unionizing, without blah, blah, blah. Right. So the whole gamut of things. So, you know, how do we have that conversation around a just transition? So there's that whole piece around moving one away from fossil fuels, and the other one is moving away from work as we believe it to be, right? So one of the things that we've been dealing with is, you know, when the OCAW first talked about a just transition, they talked about taxing everything that's bad. So bad chemicals, bad stuff. Um, you know, they produced everything from a BB gun to a nuclear weapon and 90,000 chemicals in between. So a lot, and they knew, and they came to us and they said, you know, a lot of what we produce probably does not um, belong on the face of the planet. So how do we transition out of that? So they, you know, Tony Mazaki and other folks that thought about just transition said, okay, let's tax the bad. And but when they talked about taxing the bad, they thought, okay, this would transition workers. But we said, wait, hold up. You can't only just transition workers away from these dirty jobs and dirty production. You have to transition those communities at the fence line as well,
Hmm.
right? So it has to be a transition of workers and communities, not just workers. So nowadays, what we're talking about is literally, like I mentioned before, taking the billions and billions and billions of dollars in petrochemical subsidies that the government gives the petrochemical industries and redirecting those resources into a just transition for workers, where they would have a choice of completing a four plus education, if that's what they want to do, develop worker cooperatives,
Hmm.
those that are close to retirement can take earlier retirement. And then ultimately, another one would be to give them a lump sum so that they could start their own business,
Yes, sir.
right? So at that point, I think it's really important to have that conversation around changing that trajectory and changing that mentality that a worker is disposable. No, I mean, there's a lot of things that came into play to this, Dr. Wilson. One was when we did a survey, another survey in a community, we found that, in that refinery, let's just take Phillips 66 or whoever it was, I don't remember exactly anymore, but 90% or 95% of the workers didn't come from the community at the fence line. It was workers that actually came from out of town or from further than just that area.
Yep.
So those jobs don't necessarily go to our communities in the first place. So that's why we also said we are not going to fall under this economic extortion piece in order to keep that dirty stuff going. Because politicians love to say, what about the jobs?
Yes,
Well,
sir.
guess what? Those jobs aren't our jobs. Right?
Yep.
So we have to respond in those ways as well. We have to actually push back on our brothers and sisters in the labor movement as well to include us, because we have been historically not included in these processes. So again, roundabout way to answering your question, but those are all the dynamics that we've been thinking about.
No, I appreciate that. I used the example earlier. My dad's a pipe fitter. My dad was one of those workers.
Yeah.
From Mississippi, go work in Chicago, out of Hammond, do that work, send the money back home to Mississippi. We want to make sure people that look like my dad, that gets you to the diversity, are actually from the community, and the money stays in cycles 20, 30 times in that community. That's what we need to have. And I like your example about how you shift. I want to make sure I didn't forget this. Again, I said it earlier, subsidies. That's your money, Jose,
That's
Leticia,
our money.
Yinka, Saniya. Why is your money going to subsidize petrochemicals? I don't want my money going to poison these communities, poison my community, poison my people, poison my neighbors, right? And then so if we have a major shift, that's the equity, that's the just transition, that's the just energy, the shift, the vision for the future, energy versus power. We got to stop the subsidies, and that money needs to go to the people to empower them. So that power again. So
Amen. I'm a hop on that one. 100%. That's hallelujah. And I'm gonna say this even more. If we were playing basketball and someone kept shooting the ball and missing the hoop and causing damage and injuries to others, we would take the ball from them or pivot and shoot to another player. The coach would be like, yo, pass the ball over there. Dude's wide open. Guess what?
Exactly.
We've been wide open for a long time. I'm ready to catch the ball. I myself have only a high school diploma, and I own an energy efficiency company. That company employs 25 people of color, supporting 25 families of color. These people have worked for me over 12 years. Prior to working for me, some of them were unemployed for more than 3 years. Like I said, 15 people I just met in the street have jobs for over 9 months. When I went to Congress and they called upon me to give testimony on how they could change the directory in the economics of people of color, and I was there with all other people who were not people of color. Not once did anybody ask me how people of color could obtain these jobs. Yet there I was, a woman of color who employs people of color. I actually had to raise my hand and ask Congressman Rush to call on me, which is against the rules, by the way. He broke the rules and allowed me 10 seconds to say, I've been here all day. Not one of you asked me a question on how I got here. And I'm a woman of color who employs people of color. So sometimes we have the answer, but nobody wants to hear what we have to say. So my point is, it's time to take a new trajectory. We should pivot and pass the ball from the fossil fuel industry over to someone who is not in that industry. And we should take a shot from a new perspective, offering new opportunities and opening new doors, tearing down walls as we build bridges to prosperity and agency in our communities of color and our at-risk and frontline communities. I have lots of ideas on how to do that. And if you go to www.efficiencyforall, you will find my many videos that explain the trajectory of an equal path forward on climate action with specifics, because I'm an expert in this. And it even includes the infrastructure, which our friend Saniya alluded to, and the relationships to, if we add everything electric now prior to drawing down demand, we will actually have lots of blackouts, pain and suffering in those most at-risk communities, and we might die of heat exposure or cold exposure. So there is very critical paths forward that make sense for our communities, and there are paths that we're on now that don't make sense. So I agree with you that we should take those subsidies from things that have been harming us and place them towards things that might be in a different direction, because the actual definition of insanity is
doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result.
Yes, ma'am. So thank you for that. And then, you said pass the ball to somebody else, you put them on a bench. No, they need to retire. It's past their time. So we need to retire that type of infrastructure and those dirty fossil fuel companies. I'm gonna move to Yinka next. And speaking about these partnerships and relationships. So Yinka, how has Vote bridged the gap between industry and community sectors, and what are you doing to build that trust? Because Jose talked about I call it economic development, and you got to capitalize the CON, right? Jose, it's a con job. So how are we making sure that we're not having our communities conned by these false solutions? And how is Vote an example of a different approach, as Leticia was talking about?
I love it. And the synergy here is just so amazing. So I want to start by saying one thing that Mr. Bravo just said in terms of redistributing our money toward efforts that we recognize being critical. That's really, in so many ways, what we're doing, both with Volt Energy Utility and with the foundation. So the way that our work takes form, and I won't go into a lot of detail, because when I talk about power purchase agreements with my family, they start to fall asleep. So I'm not going to bring that here. But
that's important, Yinka, though. Yinka, but that's important.
I know, but
move away from the current infrastructure. That's an important part of this discussion. Go ahead.
It is, but I also want people to stay awake. So,
okay, go ahead.
So corporations, your major corporations, they procure renewable energy. So they buy renewable energy to make the energy grids that they operate in more clean, right? So taking the majority of the energy grids from dirty fuels to clean and renewable energies, so that they can operate in energy grids that have more renewable energy. So that's one thing, right? So they do this work and they procure energy through these contractual agreements called power purchase agreements. Our wonderful CEO and founder of our solar firm came up with a very innovative approach to power purchase agreements, where he calls it the environmental justice power purchase agreement. So essentially a portion of the revenues that our company makes from building and developing solar technologies, a portion is actually dedicated to community impact initiatives. And that's primarily how our foundation is funded. So think about this at scale, right? So we're a new company. Our foundation was literally just created this year, and the firm was launched last year. So imagine at scale the amount of dollars that are taken from these power purchase agreements redirected into community impact initiatives. This is a huge endeavor and a huge opportunity to redistribute funding to appropriate ways. So I think the work that we're doing is really centered in the idea that it's funding, it's community cohesion, it's strategic, macro level coordinated efforts to really make all of this come home. And so I'm excited because I think the corporations, there's a whole conversation to be had about corporations. I'm not going to go there right now, but even corporations are recognizing the importance of thinking about renewable procurement in terms of environmental justice. And that is a very interesting premise, right? And it's still a relatively new idea and concept, but I believe that in a few years, it's going to become an industry standard, right? So leveraging your existing dollars in your renewable energy procurement divisions toward community impact. It's new now, but I think in the coming years, it's going to be all that we see. And what's exciting is you now have a generation of folks who are working within corporations, working within their renewable divisions, their sustainability divisions, with this environmental justice consciousness, right? We spend some time talking about federal efforts and things like that. I think it's also worth interrogating what's going on the corporate side. What are they talking about behind closed doors? Like, how are they thinking about these issues too? And they're really interesting folks who are thinking really creatively. And on the other side, there are folks who probably are not thinking about these issues at all. But I think for us to be aware that there's an opportunity to redirect existing funding within these corporations towards really great places, I think that's a really important thing, because then we can hold folks accountable. So I'm really passionate about my work because it's so different. It's a different way of thinking about where to get funding to do necessary work. And it's an ever evolving and growing space. So it's exciting.
No, thank you for that. And we did have a closing panel on day one. We talked about corporate action, environmental justice, and climate change. We talked about supply change, the carbon footprint. We talked about ESG and what it means. We talked about greenwashing, right? We talked about how these corporations who are trying to do these things in the sector needed to push their other colleagues in the sector, because they can be sector influencers, right? So we're gonna move to some questions from the audience. We have like 14 minutes left before we get to the close. So question to both Jose and Leticia. How do you engage the youth as well as long-term workers in the dirty fossil fuel fields to clean energy jobs? So how have you been engaging youth to get them into this space? So I'll go to Jose first, then Leticia second. Go ahead.
So the answer to that is we've done a poor job at it. We haven't done what we should be doing to engage youth. I think that for us, what we've been trying to do at the moment is like all these emerging things, putting out fires quickly and moving forward on a bunch of things that are moving on in Congress and different other places, and at the UNFCCC in last year in Scotland and such, and then moving towards how we're going to engage this year in Egypt on climate. I think that we haven't done our due diligence when in engaging youth workers. Yes, we've been sending delegations and taking delegations with us to the Conference of the Parties. They've been learning about other just transition models in the European Union and in other places around the world, and talking with workers about the do's and don'ts and how to move governments towards moving countries into a just transition type of process. I do want to mention one thing, and not related to this question, but another question that was asked. I think somebody asked me what kind of energy I would endorse. In the chat, I said, at the moment, I think what we can talk about is passive energy. There's a lot of things around passive energy that can work for heating homes, for heating water, for heating a lot of things. And that's literally passive with the same current that you have in the valve of your home when you turn on the spigot. You don't need an engine for it. You don't need a motor for it. You don't need electricity for it. Those kinds of things are important, I think. The other piece is the storage of energy. I know that here in California, I'm in San Diego, but up Northern California, there's a lot of research being done on salt-based batteries instead of any batteries having to do with heavy metals or any types of metals. It's basically batteries that use electrolytes. Electrolytes are in our body already. And then charging those batteries. The only thing right now that is holding back a lot of that research is the literal need to condense the battery to make it smaller. But those things are important.
Thank you, Jose. You sound like you sci-fi, sound like the Matrix. You're talking about using humans as batteries, but I'm just messing with you, Jose.
Electrolytes, put it that way.
Yeah, electrolytes. Okay. But Leticia, go ahead on how you're engaging youth in this work.
Phenomenal. How do we engage youth? Actually, it says, how do we engage youth and long-term workers and transitioning them from dirty fossil fuels to clean energy jobs? Well, often youth are not working in dirty fossil fuel jobs, so that doesn't seem to be a problem in this moment, but maybe not in our country anyways, I should say. Forgive me. Other countries, yes, this is true. In our own country, I have to say that it's been quite easy, in fact, to connect with the communities and engage them in new careers. Once we're able to explain to them the impacts on humans and the places they love and live, they are quite readily willing to change. It's phenomenally interesting because oftentimes they say people of color don't show up or are not interested in these things. But I find that that's actually quite contrary to the truth. What it is that no one's taking the time to go speak with them, or they assume they know what they have to say. When you do go talk to the communities, what we do is we show really short 5 to 7 minute documentaries that show real information on asthma, cancer, stroke, on all the pollution that is caused from extraction to combustion in the fossil fuel system. And then you have to give them a way out. You can't just depress them. The most important thing about our process is we tell them and then we empower them. So it isn't like, oh, you're all going to die. The world is ending. The sky is falling. It's like, hey, this is happening. And here are some potential ways we could address the problem. Like we could make your home more efficient. We could replace your showers and faucets. We could use less water that way. We could replace your domestic hot water heater and use 1/10 of the energy. We could replace your regular light bulbs with LED light bulbs, which use 1/3 of the energy. We could have you unplug your chargers. You could watch less TV and you could binge do instead of binge view, for example, which is good for you physically as well as mentally. Instead of sitting in front of your TV, you could get up and do something. All these things, though, require systemic change, like green spaces near those communities where they could go outside safely, like safe housing where they could have affordable energy. And they have to have access to clean energy resources like solar. And Saniya mentioned earlier an awesome example in DC. And I wondered after, if there's time or later, if we could find out whether that community receiving that is also receiving the financial benefits of the solar. Because I find often they don't get both, but maybe they are, which would be great. Now, the last thing I want to say, Sacoby, which I think is critical, is we don't just look at youth or adults. We look at communities. So when our teams go out into the real world, I call it the street team, we're ready to talk to people. We're not afraid of those people. We look like those people. We come in uniforms. We come in costumes. We come with games and entertainment. We bring food. We bring drinks, libations. We are having fun. And the people come and they want to talk to us. And that provides us the opportunity to say, we have these training programs. We have these books for your kids. Would you like to have an energy assessment? Would you like to connect to solar? And we're able to even more incredibly, we work with other contractors who are also minorities. So when we go in and do an assessment, the person who does their insulation is a minority, who does their window, who does their HVAC, who does their even yard rain gardens. Whatever we do, we try to be inclusive and diverse in our approach and ensure that we listen to what the community needs are before we try and solve them. So I think that has been our success, is focusing on the whole group, and providing free services is really helpful to people who are struggling. And then the last thing is to not give up on them. It sometimes takes us 1 to 7 times to help a person understand a concept. We can't just show them something once or show up and helicopter into their community and think they're just going to say, oh yeah, come work with us. You have to build relationships that are honest, transparent, and offer that community a path forward that meets a need they already have, not one we'd like to give them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's getting back to that, how you do deep, authentic, transformative engagement, and making sure that, as you said, not just problematizing but bringing solutions to the table. I think it's really important. Making sure the solutions are community driven. Like folks know what they need. They already know the problems, they know the solutions. So how can we bring the resources, opportunities to make sure to actualize those strategies and those solutions? Thank you for that. Son, you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, well, I wanted to just bring up a point in reflecting on the Inflation Reduction Act and what might happen as a result. I think it's important to look at what's been laid out as having impact on homeowners. Things like you can make energy efficiency changes in your home and you can benefit from, the reductions in the cost or the tax breaks if you own the home to do it. I think that is an important consideration, that when we look at the benefits and, we can look at, yes, there's this support for transitioning to heat pumps, and it's already been brought up related to EVs. I think that's one thing that will come out of, I think, the discussion about how the Inflation Reduction Act is going to play out, is that there's a lot of benefit to homeowners. And
yeah, but just to interject in that, but what does that mean? Because a lot of folks on the precipice of being poor and poverty are not homeowners.
Right.
So how's that bill? So I think y'all talked about before, that bill's going to miss a whole lot of folks. It's going to be good for me. I'm already in the market I've been looking for EVs all day long, but I'm good. I got privilege, right? And folks don't have the privilege that I have. So for the folks, you think about the pyramid of folks in this country, there's a lot of folks who are low middle class and dealing with poverty, right? Extreme poverty. How is that bill going to help them with a just energy transition? And right now, as y'all outlined, it's going to be an unjust energy transition for those folks, right?
That's
So
right.
I think this is a powerful point to make about the misapplication of these concepts in the bill, and it's not going to benefit us all the same way. And so again, when you flip that the way the bill's been implemented, or at least proposed, put the folks on the front line at the front of the line, then the bill's going to work. But right now, as it's outlined, I think all y'all said that with some of the nuances, some of the potential problems and negative implications, you're not going to see that. So I'm going to go. We have a few more minutes. What I want to do, I'm not gonna go back to the questions. Let's just give you time to talk about your 30 seconds, your closing statement, so we can be on time. And I love this. I could talk to y'all all day long, and I know y'all are very excited about this topic, but want to get at least some best practices, some solutions, right? We want to have solutions, some recommendations to the audience about what they can do in the community, how they can push their legislators. Let's leave them with some things, some action items they can take home. So let's start with I'm gonna start with Jose. Leave some action items with our attendees today.
So action items.
Yes, sir.
There's a couple, 2 or 3. One, we have to recognize that the global north spends 7 more times the energy than the global south. So we're used to our energy expenditures, right? We love those big houses. We love the 3 cars. We, blah, 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 this whole thing. I think cutting down personally, and also making sure that the biggest users of energy, such as the U.S. military, start leading that process as well, right? Where before they used to patrol the world and to safeguard oil, I think the new oil is going to be lithium, right? So I think moving us forward into a process where we have to, as Yinka had said before, become less extractive, I think is super important. We already have enough on the face of the planet to make whatever we want to make. Literally, we don't have to dig anymore. It's just reusing. So those are some parting thoughts.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Appreciate that. Let's go to Saniya.
Sorry.
Action items, recommendations for our home audience. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it takes me a minute to get myself off mute. I'll say that as part of the discourse, I'm an engineer. I love to solve problems. I love solutions. I love coming up with solutions. And so what I think is really powerful is in partnership with the activism to identify and lay out the problems and also devise the solutions. I'd like to see more of that in the activism, because the solutions that are being presented, there's a lot of activism going on, and then the solutions that are being presented are being presented by people who don't have that perspective. And so I'd like to see a coupling, really powerful coupling between activism for energy justice with providing the solutions.
And that's part of that power. Yep. You got to make that happen. We got to have the power, and we have to build that power. We have to use the power we have, power of the pocketbook, power of our feet, power of our voice, right? And people got to step up and step in when it comes to these conversations. And we had to have some accountability. So I appreciate that statement you just made. I'm going to go to Leticia next. Go ahead, Leticia.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the overall conference as well. But there is so much to be done to close the knowledge and accessibility gap for frontline communities and communities of color. These specific groups have been denied simple exposure to basic knowledge in public schools nationwide, and we are not supportive of science in grade schools or in our communities. Likewise, how can one be engaged in something they do not know exists or something they do not see themselves represented in? I see less people from our communities who are gainfully employed, and they cannot survive, and they suffer. And I see that in some communities, they're teaching their kids they're worth the moon and the stars, whilst in my community, you're told you get what you get and you don't get upset. So it's time to shift the thinking and change the paradigm, opening our kids' and communities' minds to the lives and empowering idea that we are all equal. And if provided equal opportunity and equal resources, we shall prevail. The first resource we must provide then is knowledge itself in an accessible format for all communities who have been left behind and left to suffer in disadvantaged circumstances without access to resources or information. Basic and decent public education is the key to helping Americans, help them find career paths, We must be honest, because a career is the next best thing behind knowledge. We could give people a hand up instead of a handout, empowering them to have systemic, future-based incomes and longevity. Unfortunately, I'm here to report that what I see is a continuation of the past, where white-led organizations and universities and well-known individuals continue to be provided resources, and folks who look and sound like me are given crumbs off that plate. We are asked to subcontract or partner, to accept pittances and funds because we cannot directly apply for these. We have difficulties in governmental processes to receive grant awards, and even Justice 40 is still taking this trickle-down approach. And whilst I honor the efforts that I see from this administration and the work being done here by incredible individuals all across our nation, I want to remind you that it's time that we waste less and do more together as Americans. We must binge do, not binge view. For it is our fight as warriors, and together we could create a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. As James Brown would say, we need to share that right on information. So I love me some James Brown. This is a quick shout out for James Brown. You know, that's philosophy of sharing information. And like you're saying, that critical literacy, right? That's the foundation for us to move forward together as a country. Thank you for that. Yinka, we're going to leave you with the last word of the day.
It's hard to follow, but, you know, I will say the climate crisis is a byproduct of environmental racism. And so shifting the way you articulate these issues with that understanding. We have to dismantle racial capitalism. That is the only way we're going to solve the climate crisis.
Thank you.
Sorry.
And as y'all was saying, the folks who are making the decisions, like you, what you said, son, we know the problems, but the folks that are making decisions about the solutions, not the people who know the problems. Get the right contextual experts, recognitional justice, 17 principles of environmental justice. Thank you for this powerful, panel. I appreciate every one of y'all. This has been great. Thank you for the audience for the questions. We'll try to make sure, get the questions that weren't answered to all our panels across all our sessions. But this has been an excellent close for day 2. Looking forward to day 3. And thank y'all again. And Noble, get us to the close, Noble. Thank you again. Thank you, panel.
Thank you.
So again, this has been a great day, as I just said. I really appreciate that last panel. How do we, really get to this just energy transition? You heard about the issues of frontline, fence line communities and what we really need to do. We need to have education, literacy, information. We need to focus on them first. Lifting all boats. We need to focus on their boats, right? We need to invest. We need to think about the different types of solutions that are out there. Make sure those solutions are coming from the people, of the people, for the people, and by the people. We got to have community science. We have to have empowerment science. We have to focus on liberation and sovereignty, right? We got to make sure we move away from our current system of dirty energy infrastructure, but also the system of who owns the energy. And we have to have the right energy. We have to build power, grow power, and make sure our community's power is at the center of this just transition. Powerful panel. And then today, I think we've had a great day, again, day 2. We had an opening plenary where, again, 3 EJ icons, Dr. Robert Bullard, Peggy Shepard, Dr. Beverly Wright. How you fund the EJ movement. It sounds like the EJ movement is going to be televised and now funded, but what we need to do to hold accountability when it comes to these new foundations, this new work, this new money coming from federal government, making sure we have durability and sustainability, right? To make sure communities have capacity, the ones that have been dumped on, used as sacrifice, dealing with environmental slavery, dealing with environmental racism, right? Dealing with energy injustices, energy poverty. Y'all know what I'm talking about. So how we move forward. You learned about how we move forward in all the sessions today. We had a reflection, on Hurricane Harvey and what's happening in the Gulf Coast, right? We had sessions about community engagement, right? Community engaged research, community science. We had sessions that talked about hyperlocal air quality monitoring and how that's a tool, again, getting the tools into the hands of the people, scientific tools that can get the action science, right? Applied science, solution science, change science, right? That's what we're about. We're about change, not, again, about problematizing, but solutionizing. I want y'all to take that home with you today. You learned about, the different types of energy efficiency and electrification and some of the things that can be done, right? When it comes to these issues. We learned about, some of the resources that folks can access. When you think about J40, how can we make sure J40 is working for the people? You got to have investments to make sure J40 is working. We heard from legislators, right, from the state of Maryland and Delaware about what they're doing around bills and how they can take the Justice for All Act as an example, how we can expand the Climate Solutions Now Act, how can we make sure we have good energy justice bills in the state of Maryland and across the Mid-Atlantic region. And we heard from agencies that are doing work around environmental justice and air quality issues in the Mid-Atlantic, and how we need to hold them accountable as we move forward to this clean energy future, okay? So this is an exciting day. I appreciate everybody who's been here and stuck with us for day 1, day 2. Remember again, this theme has been energy versus power, but people have been saying it's not energy versus power, Dr. Wilson. It's energy and power. We need both. So we get this clean energy, we have to have power, the right folks in power, the right voices being heard, right? So again, community first, y'all. 17 principles of environmental justice, recognitional justice. If we can get to restorative justice, if we can get to those reparations that Dr. Wright talked about, right? We got to make sure we put the people first. We're going to get to these energy solutions that we need to have in our communities. We got to put the people first. We got to recognize the value of those at the front line, fence line, right? That contextual expertise, cultural knowledge, our indigenous brothers and sisters, that knowledge, right? And what they've experienced, and bring that to the table. I want to thank our sponsors again for making this event a success. Noble, hit the sponsor list for me. So again, for the larger work of Siege, thank Meta, Basil's Earth Fund, and Yellow Chair as it relates to the specific work of the symposium and getting this together. EDF, Sierra Club, Namate. I heard that session went well, and session yesterday went well. So thank you, Namate, US EPA, National Wildlife Federation. Thank you for your session as well. Next slide, please. Yinka Concerned Scientists. Thank you, Astrid, NRDC. Thank you for your support as well. Next slide, please. Again, Icon School of Medicine, they did a great session today about environmental justice and liberation science. Again, science is about the people. Science for power for the people, right? Doing science for the people. Science from the people. It's all about the people, everybody. Y'all hear me? It's about the people. And the Kresge Foundation, thank you again about your session around climate equity and health programs. Thank you, Ashley and Shamar for that session. And go to the next slide, please. Thank you again for our other sponsors, SRAP. We talked about, we're going to talk about food justice and CAFOs and biogas tomorrow. But thank you again for all these sponsors. And then, just for, if there were questions that weren't answered from sessions today or yesterday, please email. If you had questions and we want to get to to the speakers, please email Siege Symposium, CEEJH Symposium @gmail.com or Siege Center, CEEJH Center at gmail.com. And tomorrow, y'all, we're going to be in person. Now, I know we're going to try to make sure we protect everybody from this COVID and monkeypox. So get there. Students Union, our STEM Student Union, we're going to start at 9 o'clock. We're going to have a great panel, 40th anniversary panel of the Warren County PCB landfill fight. Wouldn't be an EJ movement in many ways without that fight. We're going to open the day with that panel. So if you're interested in attending, please come to STEM Student Union if you already registered, right? And remember, this registration is free, but we're going to be in person tomorrow. We're going to be COVID aware, so we'll have a lot of stuff in place. So if you are coming, please make sure you take your COVID test in advance. If you are positive, please don't show up. We love you. Stay at home. But if you're not positive, please show up and participate. We're going to go from like 9 to 6 o'clock. We're having additional sessions that really focus more on the Mid-Atlantic region. Day 1, day 2, in many ways, a bit more national in scope, but day 3 is going to focus on the Mid-Atlantic region. So Delaware, Virginia, Maryland, DC, hopefully get a little bit of New Jersey in there. We're going to have some brothers and sisters coming from Pennsylvania. Jerome Shabazz, shout out to you, and some others coming in from the state of Pennsylvania. But we're going to really focus on the issues in this region and talk about, again, community empowerment, right? Energy and power. And we're going to close out with a nice panel on energy justice issues again. And we're going to have a nice little after celebration to celebrate the fact that we haven't been together in 3 years. And again, we're going to be protection first, public health first is about this, we're in public health. So come with your gloves, come with your mask, come prepared to talk about these issues, and then come with solutions and leave with solutions. So again, we're going to start at 9 o'clock. Please get in early. Stamp Student Union. If you need to get directions to the location, You can go online. I think many of the attendees have received the directions. We go online to get directions to the campus. But again, thank you for your participation. Thank you to the sponsors. Thank you for all the student interns and the staff who've been putting the work in to make this symposium a success. And we'll see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning, 40th anniversary session with Dr. Benjamin Chavis, Charles Lee, and Dolly Burwell, one of those mothers of the environmental justice movement. Thank you, and see you tomorrow. Take care.